I have been doing some research lately on dowsing, and I want to bring you up to date on what I've been finding. First of all, in order for me to describe this, when a cell in the body, the way the cells receive nutrients is they will wait till an ion of an element floats by, and then they will open up and then take in that element. It's called gating or ligand gating. You can look it up. And if there is venom in the body from a snake or a scorpion or a spider, that will prevent the cell from being able to recognize the ion, and so it will not open up and take in the element, and the cells will die because they cannot communicate in the ion level. It is also very similar where a cell would open up and take in an element, where people have found that a person, and a lot of people are sensitive and can do this, they will take like a food item, they will hold it to their chest or to their stomach, and they will feel a sensation of the body like reaching out to grab it, a leaning forward into it, just like a cell taking and grabbing that element. And if their bodies do not want it, they will feel a leaning away from it, a leaning back. But it is interesting, just like with the cell, just like with the human body, there is an ion interaction and a physical sensation of moving forward or moving away from a particular item. Now, here we go into, this is not supernatural, this is just all natural stuff. It's how the cells communicate, it's how things work. And the same thing, I have put out a pendulum science video that you can go and look at if you want more details on this. But what I found is that the body has a field where it detects ions within a certain range. And if I hold a pendulum, and a lot of people can do this, but there's even more people that cannot. But if I hold a pendulum over something, my body will, if I want it, the pendulum will begin to move one way, and if I don't want it, the pendulum will begin to move the other way. And there's two factors that have that affect this. One of which is a natural affecting of the nerves, where if you take a laser pen and point it at a far distant wall, and then you like put salt in your hand, if your body wants that salt, you will notice that the random shaking of your hand, you'll notice by the laser on the wall, that every couple seconds you will get an arc that will go clockwise or counterclockwise, just an arc. And the indication will be that your body does or does not want that. And if you put the salt down, the pattern will change. That's one of the things that affects the pendulum, is that natural thing. But there's also, just like the body or a cell grabbing something, opening up and taking in an element, or the body leaning forward or backward whether it wants something, when the pendulum begins to move clockwise or counterclockwise, I observed that the sensation is to lean into. The more my body wants something, that there's an involuntary leaning into the swing. And when I did thorough testing on this, I would take instead of using a pendulum, use a suspended rod, and I could not detect anything. It's like the energy field moves around it, and I needed something round in order to make it work. If I tested a pendulum that was not round but this way, then it would tend to want to swing in the direction of the pendulum movement as the energy flows around it. Again, this is not supernatural, this is just very, very natural. It's the way these energy flows work. And the reading on this is also able to be tested, because like if I want to find out if there's iron in something, first of all I'll put this over something and I'll see what direction I get, and then I will touch iron with this hand, and if suddenly this starts going counterclockwise, my body is detecting, the ions of my body are detecting the ions of the iron, and suddenly if I have this over iron, it says I don't want that, and it will go counterclockwise. If I take my hand off this, it may start going clockwise if I want it, or neutral, which is back and forth. Test it again, I put my hand on here, my body will detect that this iron here is within the ion field, and it can't tell if it's in the body, it can just detect that it's in the field, and then it will tell me, the reading will be no, it doesn't want any more iron. Take it off, and then it will either go neutral or it will go positive, that yes, it wants it. And that's how you can test for minerals. And we found this to be very accurate, and even double checked it whether we would do get the root end of a hair about the last 2 inches, and we could test it that way and determine what elements are in the hair. And then we would take, to double check this, we would take the tissue mineral analysis, a hair sample, and send it into a laboratory, and 100% it came back with high and low in the elements that we tested it for. Although we paid like $75 to $100 for the test, we did that mostly to get accurate numbers and readings, because this doesn't give you numbers. It just tells you whether it's high or low in something. Then to make things more interesting, we started taking a product called Ormus, and Ormus has a lot of monatomic gold in it, and the pendulum reading changed. And what it did was, we found instead of having to touch the element, we were actually able to think of the element. Or I'd think lead, and it would start going counterclockwise to detect the lead. Actually, what would be happening technically is, if I thought lead, my body ion fields would read high in lead, and so if there was lead in the object, it would start reading counterclockwise, that it did not want it. And this was really fascinating, and we double-checked that too with the tissue mineral analysis, and it was reading. Oh, and another way too that we tested to make sure that the batteries work is, we have we're not too organized in our house when it comes to batteries. So we've got all these AA batteries we put in the refrigerator. We don't keep them in the right packaging. We just dump them all together, put them in the fridge, in a bag. So if an electric toothbrush goes bad, goes dead, I have to go over to the bag, and I have to check to find out which of these batteries still has a charge in it. And a lot of times they've been in there a while and they've lost their charge. So I'll take the battery and I'll hold the pendulum over it, and if the pendulum starts to swing wild over it, I know that there's a charge in the battery. If the pendulum just sits there like it's dumb, it doesn't recognize anything, then I know it's a dead battery. And we can double check it by taking these batteries, the ones that the pendulum says are charged, put it in an electric toothbrush, and they always work. The ones that it says they're dead, we put it in an electric toothbrush, and they never work. The thing is quite accurate. How it works exactly, not exactly sure, but every time we test it, it works. But the thing that's unique about the Ormus testing, where we can actually think of a mineral, is the fact that this is related to and contained within elements. We cannot detect chemicals. We cannot detect compounds. And like if I'm going to test for chlorine, if I accidentally say chloride, it will not detect anything. I have to say chlorine to distinguish that I'm talking about an element, and then I can get a reading. And again, this is not supernatural. It is interesting because the actual elements themselves are not, the changes between atoms are not sufficient to account for the variation between the physical attributes of that element. By adding a proton, cannot explain why by adding a proton that the thing acts completely different. It is more likely that what an atom is very much like a pin magnet, or a pin key. A pin key has got a different set of pins, and you put it into a lock and you turn it, and if the pins are right, it will turn the lock. And so too, the different atoms are like a pin key, a certain amount of protons, certain amount of neutrons, certain amount of electrons, and that will open up, like Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphogenetic fields, it will open up a library of certain physical characteristics that would accompany that element, and the element is unlocked by the pin key of the atom. Now, the thing that we're finding with the pendulum is that using the Ormus readings, because of the monatomic gold and stuff that's in it, we're actually able to dial into the library for that element without using the atom itself, just by thinking of it. Again, this is not supernatural, this is just natural, and science has to catch up to how this works. Now, tracking fields. What I discovered, and I have people bring me weird things and say, test this out, what do you think of this? Doing a lot of research. Somebody asked me about orgonite, and I went and tested it and found this, and I put out a video called Crazy Orgonite Discovery, because what I discovered is that although orgonite itself is a bizarre combination of elements and wires and stuff, it's pretty messy. But what I did discover, and I have in that video, is that whenever there is a carbon-based object, energy will form around it. And if it has a point to it, what would you say, a ribbon, a tube of energy will flow out of it. And let me put these down, and let's see if I can get this reading here. And what I found, there it is that energy comes out, and I can actually track where this goes. And in that video series, I described where they go, what they do, and yada yada yada. I also discovered that there is, off the bottoms of these, a collector field, and I went into detail about that, and that reads as a negative field because it's actually pulling in energy and sending it out there. And then I wanted to test to see how bugs work, so I put a couple antennas on here, and for testing like this, they don't have to be metal. They can be anything, plastic even. So there's my bug with two antennas coming off, and the thing that's fascinating is instead of one point coming off, there's actually 2 points, and I get a negative reading off of it, a counterclockwise reading. Whereas with this, I get a clockwise reading. With the, once it's split, I get a counterclockwise reading, which I don't know why, but what happens then is the energy field that would normally come off here is split, and the longer the antennas, the higher the velocity of the energy fields that are coming off these. These are tracking fields, and I go into detail in that video series about how the tracking fields work. But this is no different than what is happening with water dowsing. When people take a couple of dowsing rods, and these are just coat hangers that I bent up, and I twisted coat hangers here to give me something easy to work with here. All you're doing is turning yourself into a bug, or as they call it, doodle bugging. These are your antennas, and what you're looking for is the same sensation that a bug will get. And so there's nothing supernatural here. This is as natural as a bug's antennas. You're just becoming a bug, and you're using all the physics that a bug would use. Okay, let me look at my notes real quick. Okay, one of the things that first interested me in the dowsing is that my father was working for the forestry department in Arizona, and one of his jobs, he and another fellow, they were hired to go out into the desert and to locate buildings that had been dilapidated, old campsites, and things that hikers had seen but were not on a GPS, were not on a map. So they were trying to help the forestry division map out, find out where these things that all these hikers had said that they had seen. And the guy that he was working with took rods and was able to find buried ceramic culverts and other objects that were under the ground by using divining rods. And this was really fascinating, and it basically talked about, it illustrated the legitimacy of actually using it, of becoming a doodle bug with your little antennas out there. So I started using these, and one of the first things that I found is I tried this at home on my cement driveway, and every time I would come over a crack in the cement, they would cross. So I thought, that's weird. I'd walk down the cement, and every time I got to a crack, they would cross. It's like, okay, that's really, really fascinating. And so then I went inside the house, and I set a jug of water on our kitchen table, our dining room table, and I started walking toward it with the rods out. And how these rods work, if you've never used them before, you either hold them loosely in your hand, but the object is to lean them up, and if you have them way down, they'll stay down. But you want to lean them back so that they're almost swinging outward. Then keep them right there on the verge of swinging outward. There you go. And then you'd start walking toward things. You actually have to keep them apart here, but they're disappearing off the screen. But you just keep them leaning, and then you walk forward and then to see where they cross. So anyhow, I'm in my house, and I'm heading toward this jug of water. And I'm walking along, and I'm not 10, 15 feet away from it, and suddenly they cross. It's like, what? Back up, they uncross. Walk forward, they cross. And I looked up, and I was underneath a ceiling fan that was running. I thought, oh, the wind must be causing these to cross. And I thought, well, how do I check this? So what I did is I turned off the ceiling fan really quick so that the blades were still going, the wind was still going, and I walked under them again, and they did not cross. I thought, okay, so it's not the blades, it's not the wind. I went back and put power to the thing again, and they crossed when I went under it. I thought, okay, there is something coming out of that fan that's coming straight down, and it's coming when the motors are powered. So then what I did is I took my pendulum, and I can detect elements, and I put it into that energy that was coming down, and it was copper. And then I went and did a test by taking a battery and touching the negative end of the battery and holding it into that field. It started going clockwise, which means that there is a positive charge to the field. And then I took the battery and I flipped it over, and I was touching the positive end of the field of the battery, held it into the field, and it went counterclockwise, which means I was charging myself with cation charge from the battery, and the pendulum was going counterclockwise. It said it did not want any more. So what I knew was that there was a column of energy. It was copper, and it was positively charged. It was cations. So then the question came, well, here's this column of copper cations. What is causing it to become a column? My first thought was it's probably due to the windings of the motor. And so then I went over to a blender that we have. I took the blender part off and used the base, and I started the blender up, and sure enough, we got the column of positively charged copper cations coming out of it. And I thought, okay, well, it's probably, again, the windings are in that direction. So I took the blender, turned it over on its side so that the windings were in the sideways direction, turned it on, and sure enough, the column was coming up the top again. So no matter how I tipped the motor, it was producing a column of copper cations going up. And I thought, well, what about down? So I slid it off over to the edge of the counter and just held it there, and then I checked under it, and sure enough, the column went all the way down through it. So what was happening was that a column going all the way through the blender bottom, it was going up and down. Well, then my next thought was, is this related? Why is it up and down? Is it related to the anion charge of the earth that causes it to create this column? And so then what I did is I took a silver fabric like this. This is an earthing pillowcase, and it's grounded, so it has an anion charge to it, and it's grounded to the earth. And I held this up next to where the column was, and the column did not change. Even though it had a cation charge and this has an anion charge, it did not affect the column at all. So I knew then that it was not related to the anion charge because it did not deflect or move the column. So I hypothesized that it's related to the bands, and there must be just bands or fibers of gravitational energy. You know, imagine if there's just a lot of fibers or bands and you inject something into it, they are forced to go up and down. So that is what I'm theorizing, is that there's bands of gravitational energy, and the introduction of energy into that, it is squeezed into a column because of the gravitational bands. Now, then we go to water. And I wanted to test water, and I thought, well, okay, well, how am I going to do this? I thought, well, I could try using the Ormus test, because I can test for elements, and I also pick up the fields that are coming off of here, which are not elements. It's another type of energy. I thought, well, maybe I can pick up an energy off of this. So I held it over it, and I said, dark matter, nothing. Dark energy, nothing. 0 point energy, nothing. So then I shook it, and then I said, dark matter, it's nothing. Dark energy, nothing. Shook it, 0 point energy. What in the world? And it started moving. I thought, okay, this is interesting. Do it again. 0 point energy. Something that reads as 0 point energy. And then I noticed when the water stopped moving, the pendulum stopped moving. So whatever it is, it reads as 0 point energy occurs when the water is agitated. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. It doesn't read when it's still. It reads when it's agitated. To what degree? And I started testing to see what degree of agitation was required to get this thing to generate. Still water will not generate the 0 point field. Then I took it into a bowl and gave it a gentle spin. It would not generate the field. Then I went and I ran it through a pipe to see if moving water would do it, and moving through a pipe would not do it. So, yet people can read these in a pipe if the pipe is older. An older pipe will work because it gets sediment built up on the bottom and along the walls. Sediment acts as a grabber. It makes the walls rough, so as the water passes through it, the sediment is grabbing it and the thing will agitate. So what I'm finding here, let's shake this up, 0 point energy, and it calmed down. It's still swinging there, but nothing. So it takes what I would describe as chaotic, random agitation to make the thing generate or interact or interface or whatever it does with 0 point energy. But again, I tested to see if it would create the column, and sure enough it did. It created the column just like the ceiling fan and the motor for my blender. And then I observed something else because I wanted to test under it. First of all, let's do the test on top. 0 point energy. There it is. 0 point energy. Now watch this. 0 point energy. Underneath, the column of 0 point energy reads clockwise. Above it, the column reads counterclockwise. Now, I did not know if this is 0 point energy that there are two different forms of it. I didn't know that, if that's what we're looking at. Or is it possible that it... I have no idea. Why is it counterclockwise above and clockwise below it? I don't know. But again, it forms into that column, which I assume is related to the gravitational bands, the bands of gravitation of the Earth. So this is what you're looking for when you're doing the dowsing. Now what happens here is you get this band, if you got water, agitating under the Earth, going between rocks, going between sand and moving around, agitating in a chaotic mood. The 0 point energy will beam up out of the ground where that agitation is occurring. Now what you're having here is you've got these beams that are coming up out of the Earth. You've got the antennas, the bug antennas, that are sending out a field horizontally, and when the horizontal fields reach the vertical fields that are coming out from the 0 point energy, what happens then is, just like with the other things, the hand will do a involuntary torque inward, and that will cause these things to cross. They do not cross on their own. It's an involuntary torque, just like it's an involuntary leaning into the pitch of the turn, or it's involuntary leaning forward or backward, or just like a cell involuntarily just gobbling up that element that it's in need of. So too, this gives an involuntary torque. And for people who are using a willow stick, it gives an involuntary torque downward. And this is not supernatural. It's as natural as a bug's antennas. So then we come to, when I was doing the research on this, I saw a lot of videos from Richard Dawkins, who is an atheist, and he was saying there is no supernatural, and none of this stuff works. It's all a bunch of hooey, and dowsing doesn't work. He said, I'm going to prove how dowsing doesn't work. And so he set up an experiment, which he says is official, and this is how he did it. He got these containers that you couldn't see into, and in some of the containers he put bottles of water, and in some of the containers he put bottles of sand, and they were numbered, and people who were dowsers were supposed to go in there and detect the bottles of water, and they couldn't do it, beyond just normal chance. And he said, well, therefore that proves that dowsing doesn't work. But the problem is that the water he's using is stationary. Stationary water does not generate the 0-point energy that the dowsers are picking up. Dowsers are picking up the water that's flowing through older pipes that is being agitated, because it has to have the chaotic agitation in order to generate the 0-point energy, or they're picking up water that's flowing underneath the ground between the rocks, and the same works with oil. Oil flowing and agitating. You can take a bottle of oil out of your refrigerator and shake it up, and the pendulums will, or the rods will cross over it, because the 0-point energy is producing that column. It's doing the same agitation. But so Richard Dawkins, he has the stationary water, and the dowsers can't find it. He says, therefore, that proves that dowsing doesn't work, and there is nothing supernatural. But the first mistake, dowsing is not supernatural. It's natural, just like a bug's antennas. And then he set up another experiment where in the basement of a house they put in new pipes running different directions, and he would determine what direction of pipe would get water flowing through it. So he would have the water flowing through it. He would send the dowser upstairs, and they would have to tell him what direction the pipe was flowing, and they couldn't do it. But again, he was not agitating the water. He was sending it smoothly through a smooth, brand new pipe. There was no chaotic agitation of the water to initiate the 0-point energy column that would form. And so Richard Dawkins, putting together a faulty experiment using stationary water and using still water, or not still water, but moving water that's non-agitated. And then he says, well, obviously there is no dowsing. Dowsing is a hoax, and there is nothing supernatural. Again, dowsing is not supernatural, but it doesn't work if you don't have chaotic agitation of the water for the 0-point energy to create the columns between the bands of gravitation. And another factor that comes into play, which is really fascinating, is that groups of this is just stones that I picked up in Florida. It's seashells, high in carbon. Groups of carbon-based objects will form a morphic field. That reads right. And it's like if it's like if it's like birds in the air, it will form a bubble around them. And in that morphic field, something happens to where they can actually fly as a unit, where they can share the same mind and instincts if they are in that morphic field, which is like a bubble. The same happens with fish. Fish can move as a unit because they're sharing the same mind and instincts inside that morphic field. And the same thing occurs with packs of animals, herds. It's common. It's not supernatural. It's natural. But the thing that was interesting here is that I can detect the morphic field. I can detect the distance to which it goes. And the interesting thing is that if I say this will not work, then I cannot detect a morphic field. Whether the morphic field stops or whether I just cannot detect it, I don't know. But the declaration of unbelief stopped that field from being detectable. Now, when I tested this and said this will not work, the points, when they have the points, here we go, it still works if I declare it. But for some reason, the morphic field, the dome, whereas this is producing a tracking field, which is a tube that goes way out and starts tracking things, and that's another video. But the morphic field stops, or at least cannot be detected by the declaration of unbelief. And so here also in Richard Dawkins' experiments, when they're setting up these things to prove a theory, to disprove things, to, you know, he's a verbal skeptic, and by his verbal skepticism, I wonder how many fields, even with dowsing, can that verbal skepticism shut down? Because as they found out in quantum physics, that the experimenter, the one who's doing the observing, actually becomes part of the experiment. And so to here, this field, the morphic field that gathers around here, shuts down or cannot be detected by the declaration. I can think in my mind this will not work, and it will not affect it. But if I say it, this will not work, then it will affect it. So I really wonder too about Dawkins' experiments, how much of what he is finding as far as people not being able to do these things, whether it's mind reading or whatever else, is their inability is actually related to his verbal skepticism, or even the energy of his mind, and that with that predetermined skepticism that this will not work, that this is impossible. And so it's really interesting, because Dawson's test, his testing of the water, is invalid because he's using stationary water or gently flowing water, not agitated water that will produce the 0 point energy. And also he is inundating the area with verbal skepticism and talking about how this is all nonsense and everything else, and that itself will contaminate the test. So just interesting stuff. Thank you.